Hey guys, Tyler Ansman here with Tyler Ansman Performance. So today we're going to talk about bench pressing for pitchers, okay? So this is a topic that gets kind of a lot of attention because there's pretty extreme opinions on both sides, right? Will bench pressing make you throw 95? Is looking at a barbell going to make your shoulder explode? Without an in-depth look kind of at the evidence, we really kind of can't sift through these opinions very well. So today we're going to dive into that. So we talk about horizontal pressing kind of as a whole category. This is where your push-up variations, cable press variations, and your bench press variations are all going to be kind of included. And so they're there and they're kind of warranted as part of a training program because they can stimulate large muscle groups, right? Such as the pectoralis major. It's generally the prime mover when we're talking about these. And that's important because the pec major is one of the main accelerators of the arm when we're talking about throwing. All right, so strength through that muscle group and through a full range of motion is a really important piece of this. All right, so while we know that horizontal pressing should be included, is barbell bench pressing necessarily the best variation for everybody? That's going to be the piece that we kind of dive into next. All right, so one of the big pluses of barbell bench pressing is that it has pretty significant loading capability. So it's going to be the heaviest kind of loaded horizontal pressing movement you can do. All right. One of the limitations, however, is that it does restrict the range of motion and it forces you to kind of stay in this internally rotated position throughout. Okay, so let's kind of dive a little bit into those. So in terms of the range of motion piece, we know that when we're talking about throwing, what we're looking for is kind of a loose and smooth arm swing into kind of a deep flip up in this kind of deep horizontally abducted and retracted position, and then a reflexive pull of the pec through. So we're talking about really extreme ranges of motion here, whereas with a barbell bench, obviously it's going to force you to stop at your chest. And so we're not going to get through those deep end ranges. We're not training those muscles at kind of their maximal end range lengths, all right? And so we're not getting strength at these extreme ranges of motion. So when we add velocity to the equation and we have more demands on those connective tissue, it will be problematic in all likelihood that we haven't strengthened that to some degree, all right? On the plus side, right, really extreme loading capabilities, guys like it, they buy into it, so we have this kind of opportunity for increased force production, but we can likely get that some other ways, so we're going to dive into some other variations that we'll use as well. Okay, so in terms of other variations for horizontal pressing, what options do we have? Well, we have lots, so any kind of push-up variations you can think of, any kind of cable pressing variations you can think of, then any kind of dumbbell or specialty bar horizontal pressing variations you can think of all work well. And this is kind of one of the conversations we have pretty frequently when it comes to why we generally aren't kind of back squatting our guys like some other places will. And it's kind of the same with bench pressing. It's not that back squatting is inherently evil, just like it's not that barbell bench pressing is inherently evil. We're talking about a really specific population here, and it may not be the best fit for them, right? So just as with back squatting, we have some pretty specific demands in terms of external rotation and kind of the positioning of holding the bar. And what we'll tend to see is with guys who back squat a lot, they may get some anterior shoulder pain and they may get some medial elbow pain. And when we're talking about throwing being kind of the most important piece of any training program, if what we're doing in the weight room is going to limit that in any way, it's a problem. And this is kind of my same feeling with barbell bench press. We have all of these other variations where we can kind of train horizontal pressing strength or specifically strengthen, the pecs, the anterior shoulder, and the triceps, where we don't necessarily need barbell bench pressing. Yes, we can maybe increase strength slightly more, slightly faster with the straight bar. However, we already know that past a certain point, that's really not relevant for improving our velocity or performance on the field. It comes down to a lot of other things, right? How well do we use these kind of end ranges of motion? How strong are we in these end ranges of motion? What are we looking like from an elasticity standpoint? How reflexive is the pec when we're talking about firing? All of these elements really come into play. And so when we have all of these other areas that we can potentially train effectively with lifts that aren't going to impact us in a negative way when it comes to pain, discomfort, or injury, that may be something we should look at. All right, so kind of next we're going to dive into what are the other demands and what does the research say about bench press and kind of the specific elements of upper body training that we need to look at before we kind of choose our movements. Okay, so what does the research tell us about the relationship between strength in the bench press and throwing velocity? There are a couple studies out there that suggest that improvements in bench press strength results in improvements in throwing velocity. However, there's some pretty significant limitations to these studies, right? In one of the studies, they used completely untrained subjects, right? So probably any improvements in strength in any movement would have resulted in throwing velocity improvements, right? So that's one limitation there. Another study did not use, they had a training group and then a group that did not train at all, right? So obviously doing something is likely to be better than nothing when we're talking about improvements in strength related to throwing velocity, so another limitation. And then there was actually another study that they did with shot putters and bench press related to shot put distance, and what they found is that over like a pretty low level of strength, what needed to happen to improve shot put distance was actually that the barbell had to be moved over a certain velocity, which meant really we're talking about bench press throws at that point, the velocity threshold they were using, which becomes a completely different movement, right? We're talking about ballistic training versus strength training at that point. So not quite relevant to suggesting that we need to do any kind of bench press type movements in order to throw harder. All right, so that's a couple of things. So what factors should we consider when we're deciding, whether barbell bench is appropriate for any of our athletes or not? So one would be injury history, right? If you have athletes with a history of shoulder pathology of any kind, especially related to supraspinatus, this isn't maybe the best choice for them, because what we're seeing is the supraspinatus is one of the muscles that's kind of in charge of basically steering the humerus to keep it on the glenoid fossa. All right, so what the rotator cuff does is basically it kind of keeps the ball on the socket, right, and centered as well as you can on there while it's going through all of these movements, which is obviously very relevant as your arm is moving through all this space when we're throwing, and it's doing it at a super high velocity. So these muscles not only have to be very strong, but they have to be very reactive as well. And so one of the things that can happen when we're bench pressing is, because of the position that we're forced into, that space around the acromion kind of gets diminished, and so we can have issues related to kind of impingement and pain in the supraspinatus and it becoming a less effective rotator cuff muscle. So that's one thing to consider. All right. The other thing would be our shorter limbed, kind of thicker chested athletes are going to have even less range of motion to go through. So are we really doing them a service by allowing them to just bench super heavy weights when they're not training through a full range of motion and actively gaining strength of those end kind of deep ranges that are going to show up on the field at a much higher velocity, right? So that would be another thing. And then our kind of final consideration would be, once we get past a certain level of strength, which is generally lower than most people think, right? So we know that in a squat related to sprint speed, that above a 1.7 times body weight back squat, we really don't see a lot of kind of benefit to on-the-field sprint speed. That's courtesy of Dr. Matt Ray. And so it's kind of a similar relationship with bench press and throwing velocity. Once we get over a certain threshold of strength for our horizontal pressing, so for us what we'll do is generally it's a dumbbell bench press, about body weight total between the two dumbbells, for a 3 to 5 rep max. Once we get beyond that, we're not going to see generally a ton of benefit in terms of increasing throwing velocity on the field. So at that point, we need to change our focus to be more ballistic, elasticity, and kind of higher velocity related to kind of check some of these other boxes that aren't getting checked by this kind of lower velocity strength training. All right, so a couple more kind of considerations when choosing your horizontal pressing movements. So one would be laxity, right? So our athletes who are very lax have all of this kind of passive range of motion. The guys, right, who can touch their toes, who can kind of leave their hands flat on the ground when they're doing a toe touch. They may have hyperextension through a lot of their joints, right? If you go through the Baton tests, they're going to get flagged on all that stuff. These are the guys who don't need to be quite as selective in their movements, because they will actually benefit from a little bit more kind of stiffness, and if they don't train through these extreme ranges of motion, it's not as big of a deal, right? Because they're already super mobile. So it may not be the worst choice for them relative to others to kind of have a barbell bench press, all right? Just something to kind of consider. The other piece would be that when we're talking about kind of athletes who have maybe issues with scapular control or specific movements that they struggle with, this may not be a great choice. So guys who come in with kind of that military posture where their rhomboids are super overactive, their shoulder blades are squeezed together, giving them a movement where we're going to lock those shoulder blades into the bench, like a bench press variation, may not be a great choice for them. They're likely to need more free scapular pressing, so push-ups, landmine presses, those kinds of things, where we're actively reaching and we're going through this kind of protraction and upward rotation as we're pressing, okay? So the other piece is guys who struggle with kind of posterior tilt of their shoulders or kind of controlling that scapular movement, this may be problematic for them, because as we get down to the bottom range of motion, we may get some humeral glide. So it's going to bang forward in the capsule, we may get some laxity and discomfort there, and that can be problematic, right? So ideally, we need to kind of help guys train through a little bit more posterior tilt, so kind of tipping that scapula back, right? If we think about it when we're on the field, when we're talking about layback, it's basically 3 pieces, right? T-spine extension, scapular posterior tilt, and then glenohumeral external rotation. So if we have this anterior tilt kind of going on and we try to externally rotate, you're not going to get very far. But if we can posteriorly tilt that scapula, we're going to be able to get significantly farther. So guys who struggle with that, the barbell bench press may not be a great fit for them. All right, so what does this mean for you in terms of whether you should bench or not? All right, so obviously I think we've kind of discussed horizontal pressing likely needs to be a part of your training program because of the benefits to kind of these big muscle groups that are really relevant for throwing velocity, health, all of these kinds of things. However, does it mean you need a barbell bench press? Probably not. Is it the end of the world if you're barbell bench pressing? No. If you're healthy, you have no kind of movement concerns, and you feel fine when you do it, probably fine. Is it something that I would give to a new athlete if they aren't already in love with it and have done it for their whole lives? Again, probably not, but I think there needs to be a little bit more nuance there. And then I think we need to also consider what are the other demands that we need to kind of check the boxes of. And it becomes the higher velocity stuff, the elastic stuff, right, the plyometric stuff. How do we get that in there? And all other things being equal, I think in general, we're better off training through a full range of motion. All right, so the barbell bench press, probably not a great fit as a primary movement for most guys, but also not this evil lift that no one should ever do. All right, we need a little bit more nuance there. We have things like Swiss bar bench press, dumbbell bench press, push-up variations we can load, landmine presses, all of these things where we can do some pressing movements that we don't necessarily need the barbell as an implement for. It's just a tool. Don't get overly attached to it. All right, if you got questions for me, drop them in the comments below. Feel free to reach out via email. Thanks for watching. See you next time.